This week, Genesis. It is going to be a great week. Great few days. So, hope you guys have been doing well. You've been enjoying your second quarter of SBS. Yeah? Been going well? Mm-hmm. How was the Gospel of John? Yes? It's okay? Okay, good. I'm glad that at least over video I could help you guys understand the book a little bit. All right. So, you guys did John like 2 weeks ago, right? Last week would be 3 weeks ago. Okay, last week you did Job and Psalms. Okay, and then the week before that was John.
It was like 5 books, and then before that.
Okay, you did letters.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm just bringing up John because of the fact that it's like, and I think I probably expressed this to you guys in lecture, is that it so strongly connects with the Old Testament. And so coming into Genesis and having the context of the gospel in mind, one of the really great benefits of doing SBS traditionally instead of chronologically is that you get to reflect upon the Old Testament events from a New Testament perspective. And you have a really good idea of where things are going. For example, if I told you to go to my grandma's house and I gave you her address, it would feel like it's a long time to get there, because always on the first time you go somewhere, it always feels so long to arrive there. But once you've been somewhere before, it feels very familiar. And so the people that are being talked about, the things that are happening are going to feel familiar to you. And you'll be able to make those connections really well throughout the Old Testament, which will be a lot of fun. And so I hope that your first couple readings of Genesis have been good. Have you enjoyed the book so far? Yes. Is it a long book? Yeah. Yeah, Genesis is probably about double the length of any book you've done so far, right? It takes roughly about 4 hours to read aloud. And so the longest read probably was Acts or Luke, which is about 2 hours and 20 to 2 hours and 30 minutes, right? So it's almost double. So this is a big task, and coming into the Old Testament, they're quite big, but did you find PTs to be easier in Genesis than ever before, right? Narrative, you'll have to suffer for the next few months. But narrative literature tends to be pretty straightforward, right? The major plot point of the book, the nice thing is while the books are larger, the structure tends to be more obvious, and the PTs tend to be a little easier with narrative than in epistles for the most part. It's a fun transition. Love the Old Testament. You guys looking forward to studying the Old Testament this quarter and for the next couple months? Right. It's so good, you guys. And Genesis is such an amazing book because of how it lays the foundation for everything else. It really is that foundation piece. And it sets the tone for the rest of the Old Testament. The word Genesis means beginning. And that really is what the book is all about. And of course, as it's the first book of the Bible, you have so many firsts in this book. First altars, right? First calling of God on someone's life. There's a plethora of them. And it sets the tone for the rest of Scripture. Now, Genesis, we tend to treat it kind of as just this almost standalone book. Because once you get to Exodus through Deuteronomy, you're going to see that those books really flow together well. There is a continuous flow from one to another, and the story is kind of nonstop from Exodus 1 through Deuteronomy 34. So Genesis stands at the introduction to these books. And the best way to think of Genesis is an introduction to Exodus. It's an important book in the foundation that it lays for the entirety of the Old Testament, but it really is an introduction to Exodus. And we'll talk about why that is when we talk about the readers and the author of the book, and help to set the tone of why Genesis operates kind of as that introduction for the rest of the Pentateuch, and how it sets the tone. Now, the Old Testament, when I think about the Old Testament in most Christians' lives, it reminds me a little bit of my own life. This is my family. There I am. I look a little bit like Alexander, if you can remember who it looks like. Anyways, that's my mom, my dad, my two sisters, and my grandparents on my mom's side. And when I think about the Old Testament, it reminds me kind of my own life, because when I was 8 years old, my parents split, and I didn't have really any interaction with my dad until my mid-20s. Didn't talk to him, didn't know where he was, had no idea what was really going on in his life. Until in my mid-20s, about 14 years later, I began to email with him back and forth. And we started to get to know each other a little bit. And at first, it was awkward, of course. You know, a parent who's been out of your life for more than a decade. And now you're trying to build some kind of friendship, and what is this, and how is this supposed to work? And so through Skype and emailing regularly, we've become much more friends than before. And so there's a much greater familiarity, there's an enjoyment of each other's company and conversation and all these types of things. But this is kind of how the Old Testament is for most Christians. Most Christians are raised on Old Testament stories from childhood, and they hear about Old Testament stories. But as soon as they become an adult, most of those things get left behind, and they just focus on the New Testament. And most preaching in church and most Bible studies focus on things inside the New Testament. But knowing our origins and knowing where we come from in our family history helps us to know who we are and how we're supposed to live now. And having a good understanding of the Old Testament sets us up well to be able to understand the New Testament better, and to be able to understand how our Christian life is supposed to be lived in light of what God has done in the past. Sometimes we can come in with preconceived notions about the past, about the Old Testament, and about what God has done or who he is or his character. And what we will find is that as we get to know the Old Testament better, we'll see God for how he has revealed himself. You know, you think of a parent, you know, in my case, my dad, who I didn't know for a long time. I had a lot of preconceived notions about who he was and how he acted and these type of things based off of what I had known from my childhood. But the more that I've got to know him, the more complete my picture has become, and the better I understand myself. You know, because of not being raised with a dad basically from 8 years old, I was very unfamiliar with who I was and how I thought and my actions. And when I started talking with my dad, I was like, wow, there I am. Like, I can see myself, like the way I think, the way I talk, my interests, my personality, my mode of conversation was almost the same. It was one of the most profound moments to experience that. And it helped me understand who I was going forward from there, because I understood where I had come from. And a lot of the Old Testament is like that. It helps us to understand how we're supposed to live then in the New Testament. So the book of Genesis gives us a lot of origins, as it is this book of beginnings. And that's really what it's all about. It's about origins. So the story is going to start where you would expect it to start, at the beginning. And that is where we will start. Okay, so our kind of agenda is to go through the background to set the tone. We're going to talk about the BRI stuff for Genesis. We're going to also talk about Old Testament historical narrative literature and how to engage with it, interpret it, read it well, what to expect from it, so that we can be good students of that type of literature. And then we'll go into the book. And so kind of my goal for today is to get through the first 3 chapters of the book. So, and then tomorrow we'll finish out the rest of 1 through 11, so 4 through 11 in that case. And then we'll cover Abraham, and then and then we'll start to touch on Isaac. And then on Thursday we'll do Jacob and Joseph. Okay? Sound good? All right. So, what are your guys' thoughts on Genesis? Doesn't have to be profound. It's big. There's 7 pages of PTs.
I think one thing for me that I've been noticing is that God chose Abraham and was like, I'm going to bless you, and then his sons just kept seeming to not make the mark of what we think they should, but God continued just to be like, okay, but I'm going to give you wealth and I'm going to give you sheep, and even if it seems like you really, really mess this up, I'm still going to protect you, and it doesn't make sense.
No. And that's the goodness of God, you know, which it just doesn't, like, we're like, God, why are you doing this? And you'll get ready to ask that question a lot, because you will definitely disagree with the way God acts. Because he's often, you know, most people come into the Old Testament thinking, I'm going to disagree with God because he's so wrathful. And instead you come in and you're like, I disagree with God because he's too good. You know, like, he's too nice to people. You need more wrathful, God, like, judge those guys. You know, you're like, okay. You know, and so, yeah, we see that character of God. He's so faithful. Yeah, amen. Good. Somebody else.
I have a question actually. That's a good question.
Sure, we can. I might put it on the board and not answer it now, but you can ask.
Okay, so you know, Cain and Abel.
Yep.
So, okay, he kills Abel, right? Yeah. And then when after he did that, he was afraid that all the people was gonna hate him.
Yeah.
Well, what people were there?
Yeah, wives / other people. Where did they come from? Yeah. Great. Any thoughts on the book? What has stood out to you?
What stood out for me is like the author says something, and then afterwards he kind of goes back, and like so you kind of have the end and then the beginning, and then sometimes a bit confusing.
Yes. And it is confusing because you're going to get the death of people before they actually die, chronologically. So, for example, it recounts the death of Abraham, but he would have known Jacob and Esau. You know, like, they would have sat on his lap, he would have been around them until at least they're 20 years old. You know, like, it's not like Abraham, you get his death before they are born or right around their birth, but he lives with like 20 years after they're born. So, yes, that is a great observation. Got one more person. Something that stood out to you from Genesis.
The baby battles.
Yeah.
So many babies and competition.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so hectic.
That's so funny because I've never heard anybody call it that, but I called it that. I called it that on my charts in SBS.
No way.
Yeah, that's so funny. So I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah, there is some surprising events.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll get to talk about some of those. But let's talk about the book. We're going to look at some questions here in the BRI and just kind of get the scope of this book. Okay, so when we're thinking about Old Testament narrative, one of the helpful things to do is to look at the span of time in which it takes place. Now, that doesn't help us very much for Genesis, sadly, but the earliest event that we see is creation, or Genesis chapter 1, where God is ordering the universe. And then the latest, of course, is that Joseph is going to die in Egypt. And so to give us kind of a span of time, when did these events occur? Okay, well, when we look at creation, this is probably one of the most challenging ones to date, just because of the Hebrew literature. Genesis 1 through 11 is some of the most challenging scripture in the Old Testament as a whole, because there are so many unanswered questions, and there's so many assumed understandings by the author. The author just assumes that you know certain things, and he's writing that with that expectation. But he's also writing in a way that he's not trying to answer 21st century questions. Right? He's trying to answer 2nd millennia BC questions for people who've come out of slavery. Okay? And so the answers to our questions may not be what we want them to be. And there may not even be answers to questions that we have in the 21st century. Is Moses trying to give an origin story for the universe? It's a question that we should even be asking about the text, not when did this happen? Is this what that story is? So when we look at the earliest events of creation, there's a few ways of touching on this event or talking about when things really started. Now, the late date, okay, so we're going to be talking about BC. So late means closer to us, and early means farther away from us. Okay, when we're talking about AD, early means farther away from us, and late means closer to us, right? So got to switch our minds a little bit, talking about BC here, okay? So early, or the late date would be about 4000 BC. Okay, this is an exact calculation based off of the genealogies from Noah and from Adam that would then go back to dating the Genesis chapter 1 story to a 6-day creation story of 24-hour periods that can be dated roughly or exactly to the month of June 4004 BC. So that's where some people will place the dating. Now, the challenge with this date, of course, is that the second chapter of Genesis seems to be just a retelling of the same story. But it's different, right? The story is quite different in Genesis chapter 2. And so taking Genesis chapter 2 and looking at it as a 24-hour period would be quite challenging considering Genesis chapter 1, 6 24-hour periods, right? So if Genesis chapter 2 all happens on the 6th day, or if there doesn't seem to be plants in Genesis chapter 2, there's just a lot of confusion on how to relate these two. The middle late date that people will go with for the events at the beginning is sometime between 30,000 to 50,000 BC, roughly. The way we get this is that, according to anthropology, the earliest presence or records of human intelligence existence is roughly about 30,000 to 50,000 BC. And the way that people will then say, okay, the Bible is talking about this, is that genealogies in the Old Testament repeatedly skip generations. Okay, in our modern time, we look at genealogies as a way to prove origin. Who were your parents? Who were their grandparents? Who were your siblings, your cousins, all the rest? In Hebrew genealogies, they will repeatedly skip generations. Okay? It is not uncommon for generations to be skipped for the purpose of telling a story, or for the purpose of just proving a point, or simply moving the story on more quickly. Okay, so sometimes genealogies will skip generations. We see this in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, verse 8, where we can clearly see that 3 generations have been left out of Jesus' genealogy. Now, Matthew is a very precise writer, and so he's doing this very intentionally, but he's following along with his common Hebrew writing style. And this comes into play with the idea of the word son of, or ben, in Hebrew, can not just mean son, but it can also mean descendant. Okay, so it doesn't have to mean a blood heir to that fatherly figure. It could just mean somebody in the lineage of that person. And so it's just used to signify a broad familial heritage and social relationships, not as much father-to-son relationship. And of course, this perspective will take the events of Genesis chapter 1 as a 6-day creation period, but that Genesis 1 through 11 takes place over a vast period of time. The very early date, which will follow much more along with what pretty much the modern scientific discussion on the origins of the universe is to date the origins of the universe to roughly about 14 billion years ago, and then the creation of what we see around us to roughly 4 billion years ago. And they would still talk about the origins of humanity as being 30 to 50,000 BC, because that's when we start to see records of human existence. They would take the look of Genesis chapter 1 as a figurative account of the creation story, that this is not specifically the exact way that it took place, but it is a figurative way of looking at it. And this comes up because of the rhythmic flow of the passage. It's much more poetic, and it flows very figuratively. For example, it starts every day, God said, and then it ends the first day. God said, second day. God said, third day. And it flows like a poem in how it is recited. The first 3 days parallel the next 3 days. And what is placed, the land coming up, and then the the animals on the land. And so these type of things all parallel each other, and there's a lot of structure in how Genesis chapter 1 is laid out. And so they will emphasize that as being the way that God has created or organized the world, and that it took place over a long period of time, but Genesis chapter 1 is a retelling of that story in a figurative pattern. All right. Now, the question that most people ask is, which one is right? Which one should I believe? And that's really up to you. Because at the end of the day, no one really knows. At the end of the day, this conversation can go on endlessly. What is important about the conversation is that the Bible affirms that God created the universe. And he did it by himself, without any help. Okay, that's the most important thing, is that God is the creator. Now, we do know that he creates from nothing, and the rest of the Old Testament affirms that. And so regardless of our take on Genesis 1, regardless of our take on the dating of Genesis 1, the Old Testament affirms God's creative power from nothing. And that's the most important thing. Because what we'll look at with the historical background is that that is not the way that the other nations looked at the creation of the world, or the origins of things. Thankfully, the dates pretty much after the time of Abraham are a little more easy to place. Okay, so with the death of Joseph in Egypt, we have this roughly about 1850 BC. So thankfully, these dates after Abraham come a little more easily. We still do run into some concern or some questions over the length of people's lives, and especially with Hebrew numbers. One thing to be aware of with Hebrew numbers is that Hebrews in the ancient world are not known to be mathematicians. The Sumerians are known as the mathematicians of the ancient Mesopotamian area, and the Hebrews are not. So what you will notice repeatedly throughout the Old Testament is that numbers are very often rounded to the nearest whole number. So living to 120 years, 140 years, 110 years, and it's not just like they held out, like I'm 108 years old, I'm ready to die, but I'll wait until I'm 110. They were probably rounding some numbers out. When you look at the censuses, you're going to see a lot of rounded numbers at the end. Okay, and that is just the culture of what they did. And so it's very likely that they are rounding numbers either to the nearest whole number or the nearest 10 number, either up or down. And so that's just kind of how they will operate. That is going to be offensive to you because we like very strict, accurate mathematics. Okay. We want things to be exact, right? But a cubit, for example, the length of a cubit, which was the standard measuring, is measured from your elbow to the tip of your fingers. So a cubit ranges person to person. Okay? So just as one example, that's kind of how the Hebrews are looking at their mathematics and building things. They're not just pulling out their ruler with their centimeters and gauging how many meters to build their tabernacle. They're like, okay, well, that's about a cubit right there, and so we're going to lay that out, and that's going to be how far we go for everything. So that system, you just got to be aware of that, and you got to be okay with it. It's just one of those things. Well, there's going to be a lot of those things. You're just going to have to be like, well, I'll just have to accept that. And so this gives us a rough time. Now, up until about the time of David or Solomon, which will be in the United Kingdom period of Israel's history, so up until about 1000 BC, everything before this time is going to be circa. Okay. So circa just means around that time. We can't nail it down exactly, firmly. It's just going to be roughly about 1850. Okay. So you'll just have to bear with the dates a little bit. We'll talk about how we get the dates in just a moment when we talk about dating of the book. And then that'll also tie into how we date the rest of the Old Testament and some of the fixed dates that help us do that. Okay. So let's talk about this question of who wrote the book. Okay, so coming from the New Testament, where the authors pretty much tell you who they are. And even those books that are anonymous, for example, the Gospel of John, he still kind of throws himself in there at the end. But in the Old Testament, pretty much every single book is going to be effectively anonymous. Yeah. So a lot of the BRI questions will have to be things that are implied from what we observe in the text rather than explicitly stated in the text. Okay. Now that might be a little bit irksome to some of us coming into the Old Testament, where we want everything to be cut and dry, but that's just not the way biblical scholarship is. And as we talk about this authorship question, you'll see how that kind of progresses. So let's talk about the two primary perspectives on authorship of the Pentateuch. We'll talk about the most recent suggestion, or the most recent popular suggestion, and that is what is known as the Jedp theory. Or it is also called the documentary hypothesis, which you will see it labeled both things in dictionaries. Okay. So the Jedp theory asserts that there are 4 strands of documents that the Pentateuch used as its sources when it was compiled by editors after the exile. Okay. So this would be sometime between 539 through probably 4, maybe not that late, 500 BC. Okay, so that's the assertion. Sorry, it's not the best pen to use. I'll use black. Okay, so 539 to about 500 BC would be roughly the time that they would propose this to have taken place. These 4 strands to have come together and brought together by editors and organized into what we have now as the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Some of these, and we'll talk about when these were written. Now, the way that these are distinguished is by various categories. So 2 of them are distinguished by the names they use for God. So whether Yahweh or Elohim, as there's 2 primary ways to refer to God and using his name. This proposition initially came in the 1880s. So it's only about 140 years old, but it rose to incredible prominence in the 20th century. And many, many, many scholars, including conservative scholars, moved towards this theory as the primary perspective on how to understand the authorship and organization of Genesis, and the rest of the Pentateuch, for that matter. So what is this? What are the different letters? Okay, so we got the J, which comes from this was proposed by a German scholar, and so the J for Yahweh comes from how it is spelled in German. So the Yahweh's portions are the parts of the Torah, or the parts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, where the author uses Yahweh for God. Okay. Now, this is thought to have been written in the southern kingdom of Judah in roughly 950 BC. Real quick, are you guys aware of the flow of the Old Testament a little bit? Judges, the kings, the divided kingdom. Are those exile? Are those terms unfamiliar to anybody? Okay, so let's talk real quick. Israel is in Egypt, and when they're in Egypt, they get brought out after the plagues in the book of Exodus, and they are set to be made their own nation. They come to Kadesh Barnea in Numbers chapter 14, where they rebel against God, and they're sentenced to walk in the wilderness for 40 years. After the end of 40 years, they come into the land of Canaan. They conquer it through the leadership of Joshua. After the time of Joshua, there is no leadership in the land, and judges begin to rise up. Judges are military leaders. So as they rise up in the land, there is really no unified leadership over the land for about 300 to 360 years. And then the last judge, Samuel, he will be the one who they say, please give us a king. And Saul is given to the nation. And Saul is the one who is the first king over the whole of the people. And this is the beginning of what's known as the United Kingdom. Okay. And then we have the time of David, who will rise up after Saul and replace him. And then Solomon. These will be the only 3 kings of the United Kingdom. Okay. In 930 BC, you have a split. Okay? So there's a split of the kingdom, and 10 tribes, roughly, go with the north, and they will be called Israel. And they will last until 722 BC. And there will be 2, roughly, in the south, who will be known as Judah. Okay. So from 930 they split, and they are never reunified. Okay. Israel will become what is referred to in the north as Israel, 10 tribes, and they will last from 930 to 722 BC, and then they will be taken away from their land into exile by a foreign nation called Assyria. They will never come back to their land. Judah will continue on until 586 BC, at which point they will be taken by Babylon and taken to Babylon. And after roughly about 50 years, from 586 until 539, they are allowed to go back to their land by a king named Cyrus. So from 586 through 539 is exile. That's what we refer to it as. Okay, so that gives you a rough timeline. Okay, so when I say Judah, the Yahwist comes from the Judah kingdom. It's this kingdom. Okay, and if I'm going to talk about the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel, this is what I'm referring to. But when you guys read the Old Testament, when you see Judah and Israel, you'll have to be able to either distinguish contextually whether it's the 2 different kingdoms, or whether it is just the tribe, or whether it's the whole nation, or whether it's the person. So context would be the most helpful thing to understand that. Because even in the book of Genesis, these kind of distinguishing terms begin to come up. And other tribes that have not become tribes yet are referred to. So, all that to be said, the Yahwist portion is proposed to have been written in the southern kingdom of Judah, about 950 BC, before the split of the kingdom. You have the Elohist portion, which is proposed to have been written in the 850s in the northern kingdom of Israel, as a way to keep the people from returning to Yahweh in the south. Okay. They begin worshiping idols and following new gods, and so they're not using the covenant name of God, but another name. Okay, so that's the proposition for this. The Deuteronomist portion is primarily the book of Deuteronomy, and that is suggested to have shown up around 600 BC, when Josiah, a king in Judah, is reforming the temple system, and the priests find a copy of the law. And these scholars will propose it was the book of Deuteronomy. And those priests wrote the book at the time. The next is the priestly portion, so Jedp. And this is the portions of the Pentateuch that are just concerning ritual worship, various genealogies, and ritual laws. Okay, so all this stuff, and this is littered all throughout the Pentateuch, from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy. You can find aspects of these things: genealogies, ritual worship, priestly roles, that kind of stuff. So these are the 4 portions of this source theory, or this documentary hypothesis. Now, this has become quite popular amongst liberal scholars and even some conservative scholars in the past century. And so there's some claims that people will make for this, and that is, for example, that in Genesis chapter 36, verse 31, blocking the slides here, that in Genesis 36:31 it says that there were kings reigning in Edom before there were kings in Israel. But there's no kings in Israel until about 1000 BC. Okay, so that has to be a later addition, and they would say that's because it comes from a later time. Or, for example, you have the mention of the land of Dan in Genesis 14:14, when Abraham comes into Canaan, and it says that he pursued them as far as the land of Dan. And the land of Dan doesn't become a conquered portion of land until almost 800 years later, after Abraham's time. So, that would have to have come from a later period of time. And because of the way the books are written, various styles of writing, various vocabulary, and the differences between the books, that there must be multiple authors that have written into them and have contributed to them. But as scholarship has progressed in the 20th century, specifically on things like origins and writing of texts, this perspective on the Pentateuch has fallen out of style. And many scholars, including liberal scholars, no longer hold to this perspective. And the movement in biblical studies has moved away from trying to find the original text to now studying what we have been received, or what we have received. Okay? So they know, very few scholars now care about what is called redaction criticism, which you will see in the dictionaries if you read. And redaction criticism is the study of the books to try to find the origin text. And it's very unpopular these days. Really, nobody is doing that because it's a completely speculative and futile pursuit. We will never know. So that's kind of where this has gone, is it's trended away. But the reason I bring it up and walk through it so clearly is because you will read about it still, because most dictionaries that are used today are published within the past, or published 20 plus years ago. And so a lot of them are going to still talk about these types of things. But in more recent times, that kind of scholarly discussion has fallen out of style. On top of that, Mosaic authorship has pretty much held traditionally for about 1,800 years, or close to 1,900 years, that Moses was the primary author. That doesn't mean he's the only author, but the primary one. Okay? And when we talk about authorship, we're more referring to the idea of contributing. Okay, so this is not they sat down and they penned it themselves, but they are the primary contributor. They're the ones who are organizing it, formatting it, making sure everything is put together, that kind of thing. They're like an editor of it, even though they may not be the one who's primarily writing it. They might be working with a team of people. Now, one of the reasons as well that the Jedp theory fell out of style is because there has never been found a single scrap of evidence for any other style of authorship for the Pentateuch. It has always come down in the same format. And the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was part of the moving towards this perspective, is that our earliest copies of the Old Testament came from 1,000 years after Jesus, until the Dead Sea Scrolls. And at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we were finding manuscripts that were 1,100 years older than our earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament. And they were saying the exact same thing. So that began to move people away from that field of study because it seemed to be fruitless. And as we see throughout the Bible, and as good Bible students who have a high view of Scripture, we see that Scripture testifies to Scripture, and that throughout the Scriptures there is testimony to Moses' authorship or primary contribution to the books of the Pentateuch. So even in the books of the Pentateuch, we do see the ability for Moses to be able to write something down. God commands him, write this down, or record these things. Or then in Numbers chapter 33, verse 1 and 2, it says that Moses wrote down all the places that they had gone. And so what we see from these books is that Moses has the capability to write. And while he never refers to himself in the first person, which is not uncommon, we'll talk about that in a moment, or in the next session, that Moses is referred to throughout the books as being able to write and to record. And then almost immediately you get, for example, in Joshua, written in the book of the law of Moses. Right? It already begins to refer to these books that are labeled with Moses as the primary contributor. They are his books. And so we get a number of claims throughout the Old Testament, and this can go on and on. I've just listed some primary ones. On top of this, the New Testament also claims this, and Jesus as well, where Jesus will say, or where Paul will say such things as Moses truly said, or Moses writes, or Jesus himself will claim, have you not read in the book of Moses, or Moses wrote about me, offer gifts that Moses commanded you, and these will come from these various passages. And so what we do see is in the New Testament times, and our New Testament authors, understand the origin of the Pentateuch as primarily from the hand of Moses. One of the things that really helps to date this and put it into Moses' hands is the understanding of Egyptian culture. Okay. In the ancient world, when you're writing something that is very old, you can't just go down to your library and check out books from the ancient Egyptian section. It had to have been somebody who was an eyewitness who understood these things, especially when you start to consider the fact that certain ritual practices of the Egyptians are not practiced continually, but only for certain periods of time. And so when Moses is writing about those things, in the same period of time that have being instructed in Egypt and being written about in the book of Genesis, for example, that it helps to corroborate the validity of the book. So some of these things would be the custom in Genesis 41:14, where people are supposed to shave their head before going before the Pharaoh. The practice of divination used by Joseph in, the cup that he has in his house as he's married to the daughter of the priest. The Egyptian practice of embalming and mummification seems to be well known and understood, as it talks about it with Joseph and his bones. And so somebody who has some kind of understanding, familiarity with the culture is the one primarily contributing to this. As well, we get this passage in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, which helps us to understand Moses a little bit more, where Stephen will say, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deed. Now, when we think of Moses, we commonly think of him as the blubbering fool who can't talk to people. He calls himself a man of uncircumcised lips and has a fear of public speaking. But the way that Stephen refers to him is in light of the education that he would have received in the household of Pharaoh. He would have been trained how to write in the styles of the day. He would have been trained in multiple languages. And what we see when we begin to compare the Pentateuch with other ancient writings is that it is not that different. Not topically, but stylistically. We see genealogies are regularly included in ancient writings in obscure, seemingly obscure places, as they are in Genesis. We see as well that there is a common shift in writing styles between poetry and prose, but also between various types of writing. And so where you're going to have, at the end of Genesis, this kind of novel of Joseph, right? When you read chapters like 39 through 50, it feels like you're reading a novel. It's just like the flow of story, the drama, the climaxes, the crescendos, all across these chapters. You're in the midst of a book, right? But when you read about Abraham, it seems like it's just a compilation of stories from his life. And so the shift in style of writing is something that is also common in ancient Near Eastern literature when they're trying to explain a specific point. And so they will switch to a different style. And so these type of things are common in the ancient world and help us to understand Moses as the primary contributor. Now, I continue to call him that because there are very clear edits later on. And this is something that is totally acceptable and is not seen as a distortion of the original because of the value and integrity that Hebrew scholars had in transmitting the scriptures. So they would make various edits that would help to contextualize a passage for people to understand it. So where was Abraham going? Well, labeling it the land of Dan helps people to understand it better later on, who are more familiar with that location by that name. If he uses an older name that people may not be familiar with. Talking about kings in Edom before kings in Israel is just a way of adding in some extra dating information into the book. So these kind of edits that come in are pretty much seen as a way to update the text for people to understand. And this happens all the time with writings in our modern period where someone is not trying to intentionally deceive or distort the text, but they're trying to help readers understand it better. You think of Shakespeare. If you try to read Shakespeare in the original Old English, it is very challenging. Or Beowulf, I've used that example before. Beowulf is the oldest English writing in existence, and it is impossible to read by any modern English standards. Because the spelling is completely different. The grammar is completely different. You can't read it. And so there has to be updates to languages, there has to be updates to places, to names, to help us to understand certain things. Okay? So those type of edits are very acceptable in the ancient world. Any questions on the author's conversation? Okay, let's talk about when this book was written then. You guys ready to do some math? Didn't come to SBS to do math, did you? Too bad. So when was this book written? Well, the verse that you're going to get very familiar with over the next couple of months is going to be 1 Kings 6:1. This is, you guys remember Gallio in the New Testament? He's like the fixed date of the New Testament, and we can date everything around him. Right? He's like the most important figure in the book of Acts as far as dating goes. 1 Kings 6:1 is the Gallio of the Old Testament. This helps us to understand so many dates based off of what it says in this passage. So let's all open up to 1 Kings 6:1. Can someone read it for us nice and loud?
In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord.
Great. Clear as mud. So the passage here is going to help us a ton with understanding. So let's walk through this a little bit, because all of those dates are very relative to the context of the book. So let's step outside of the book for a moment and put some dates on these statements. Right? So Solomon began his reign in 970 BC. What does this verse tell us right at the beginning? What's the first thing it tells us? Like at the beginning of this verse, what's the first kind of date instance that we get?
480th year after
Good. Which is? What did it continue? Which is what?
the 4th year of Solomon.
4th year of Solomon's reign. Okay, great. So if he started in 970, then what is the 4th year of his reign?
Yeah,
966.
No,
All right, we're counting down. Don't forget. 966. Okay, so 966 is the 4th year of Solomon's reign. That's the year that he started building the temple. So, the 4th year of his reign is 480 years after the Exodus. So, when did the Exodus happen? $480 years. Yeah, so yes, you add 486, and that gets us to
1446.
great. So the year 1446 gives us the date for the Exodus. Okay. Why do we care about this date? Because if we propose that Moses is the author, then he would have written it after the Exodus. Some of you might ask, well, why doesn't he write it before the Exodus? Because there's no reason to write it. He hasn't been called by God, right? He doesn't know he's going to go back and free his people. He has no intention or ambition of making Israel a nation. And as you guys know by now, every book is written for a purpose. And so, Moses has no reason to write this book before. And so it must come after the Exodus has taken place. So, sometime between 1446 and, you guys know when Moses dies. You don't have to give a date, but an event or time. Before entering the Promised Land. Good. So, how long was the period of time between the Exodus and the entry into the Promised Land? 40 years. Good. Okay. So, 40 years is the time between the Exodus and the entry to the Promised Land. So that means that the book could have been written between what times? Great. 40-year period. So you just have to get used to subtraction and addition again. Okay, so this gives us a rough date for when the book could have been written. Okay, a good 40-year span. This is about as precise as you're going to get for any book in the Old Testament. Is about this window of time. Just because everything's going to be circa. Okay. So Israel is wandering for about 40 years, and this would be then when the book is written. But when we think about when the book is written, where is Israel right after the Exodus? They spend 1 year at Sinai. Great. So Israel spends 1 year at Mount Sinai, which is where they're going to receive the law. It's where they will get the instructions for the tabernacle, and they'll build the tabernacle. They get instructed on how to organize their camp and how to march and all these types of things. So they are there for 1 year. So if we think of that 1 year at Mount Sinai, that would be from roughly about 1446 to 1445 or so. We're dealing with circa, so I've got a 2-year gap up here for us. Now, knowing Moses is the author, knowing the date of the book, this can lead you then to where it's written. Okay, so where is the book written at?
Sinai or the wilderness?
Great, Sinai or the wilderness. Because if Moses has the purpose of writing the book for the origins of Israel, and that really only happens to be necessary after the Exodus, then Moses is writing the book sometime between the Exodus and his death, which is a 40-year period between 1446 and 1406, where they are going to be in the wilderness. Now, if we want to narrow this down to some exact location, super speculative, very hypothetical, then you could say the 1 year when they're at Mount Sinai, Moses writes the book of Genesis. But this, again, very hypothetical. I think it's much safer to put it sometime in the 40-year period. Okay. And thinking about the book, then, this also we want to think maybe about, like, where did Moses get this information from, right? Did Moses just know all of this information? Did he have it passed down to him? Did he source it from somewhere? Where did he get this information from? Okay. There's a couple of options, okay? And very old Jewish suggestion from rabbis is that while Moses was on the mountain for 40 days, God was speaking to him about the origins of his people. And so Moses had received the revelation of what he would later write down as the book of Genesis. That's a very old tradition from the Jews. There are other options, though. The first is that it could be oral tradition. Now, when we think of oral tradition today, we often think of fish stories. That's an American idiom, but a fish story is that you went out with your buddies 5 years ago and you went fishing. You caught the biggest fish of your life, right? The next time you tell the story, it's the biggest fish of your life, right? And the next time, it's the biggest fish of your life, right? And it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And that's a fish story. And usually when we think about oral communication, we think about fish stories. They can just change whatever they want, and they can adjust it and kind of share it however they feel the best. That is an abomination to oral tradition cultures. The way that they pass on stories is through, how do I want to call them? Like, they're not proofreaders, but they would be like proof hearers. Okay, so what would happen is that stories are not just passed on one-to-one. Stories are told to a community, usually in gathering settings of some kind of feast or festival or important dinners or when they're gathered together for music or dance or things like that. And the elders in the village would tell the stories of their people. And so they would pass on these stories of their ancestors and, what God had done or what had happened in the past and the genealogies of their family. And they are very accurate with what they say because, as it goes, if they mess up a detail or get something wrong or change something in the story, there's about 8 or 10 people in the circle who automatically correct them. And so they have a bunch of proof hearers so that the stories are always passed down accurately. And then that always repeatedly happens. Okay? And so Moses, carrying oral tradition from his people, could have had those stories passed down. Now, where would he have heard those stories from? Well, there might have been people in Egypt who had carried these stories while they were in Egypt, but when Moses goes to Midian, after he runs away after killing an Egyptian, he goes to the land of Midian and he meets this man named Jethro, or Ruel, or Hobab. He's called 3 different names. And he is called a priest of Midian. Well, the Midianites are descendants from Abraham. And so it is possible that Jethro passed on stories to Moses as well. So that could have been a possible source for him. Okay, so that's one of the possible ways that Moses could have known these things. There is one other way, and that's there's this key word that comes up 11 times in the book of Genesis. It is a Hebrew word, toledot. Now, the Hebrew word, toledot, will come up in these 11 places, and it will often be translated as, these are the generations of, or the descendants of. And it might come up in a couple different ways than this, but these are the 11 times that it will come up in the original language. Now, why is this important? Well, it shows some kind of source information as something is repeated over and over and over. And what archaeologists have discovered about ancient clay tablets is that clay tablets in the ancient world were well organized, like a bookshelf in an ancient library. In fact, the Assyrians, there is a very famous king, Ashurbanipal, who kept a library in the city of Nineveh. And his library had tens of thousands of clay tablets from various places. Have you guys ever heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh or Enuma Elish? Those stories from ancient Mesopotamia were only discovered once his library was found at ancient Nineveh. And those clay tablets give us the stories. Okay? And the clay tablets, when they were kept on tablet shelves, not bookshelves, the tablet shelves, they would put them in sideways. Now, if you want to know what's on a tablet, then how can you find that out quickly? Well, they would inscribe something on the spine of the tablet. And so you would know what that tablet's about before you ever pull it off the tablet shelf. Okay? And toledot is one of the ways they referred to stories of their people. So it would give the generation of the father of the person who the story will be about. Okay? So Abraham's stories are not called, these are the generations of Abraham. It's called, these are the generations of Terah. And then it will tell the story of Abraham. Right? And then these are the generations of Isaac. And then it will tell the story of Jacob and Esau. Okay? Or Jacob, particularly. Okay. So that's how the book is kind of organized. And so some scholars these days propose that this is really what we want to look at as probably the primary source for Moses' information. And somehow these tablets have continued to be passed down and carried maybe from Abraham, from the land of Ur, which is where clay writing first began. And he may have brought his family history with him from there and had brought that along, and then that got brought down to Egypt. So that's one possible suggestion. Okay. Any questions? So critical information done. We're going to talk about some more historical information, OROA, but let's take a break. Sound good? Okay. We do 10 minutes, start at 10:45? Of readers, audience, that kind of stuff. And so a lot of the culture is going to be the same. reader to audience, but their social setting or their setting in life is going to be very different. Okay, so a lot of the value systems and things are very similar. So you want to, I'm not going to teach them both distinctly. There will be a lot of overlap in how we look at the two of them. Okay, so when we think about what is God doing with Israel, the people in the story, what kind of things is God doing with them? Well, we see really God birthing a nation. Okay, He is choosing His people, He's forming them, He's giving them promises and a future that they will become His people. Right? That's seen in the major transition in chapter 12 when the story shifts to Abraham. We'll see kind of how that progresses. So that's one of the major things that God is doing, and a lot of what the book is about. Okay. We often, again, like Ernest said, there's more than creation in the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is primarily about Israel's origins. The book also gives an incredible glimpse into the character of God, like is being said already. The mercy, faithfulness, and grace of God that is so abundant in the midst of man's utter rebellion already. Right? From the fall to Cain murdering his brother, to the flood, to the Tower of Babel, to Abraham giving Sarah away twice, Isaac doing the same thing. You know, time after time after time, people are messing up, and a lot of times pretty bad. And yet God is still faithful, and He's merciful. And He's trying to teach His people that because none of the other gods are that way. We'll see that. That God is set apart in how He cares for and loves His people before He ever asks anything of them. And that's what sets Him apart so dramatically. And it displays His trustworthiness. That God can be trusted to come through and be faithful to what He has said, and that His promises will be upheld. He can be relied upon, and that He is worthy of their faith. So we see that how God is trustworthy, and trying to display that heart and that piece of His character, and that God works with the sinful people. This is an incredibly important lesson, and it is something not only important for them, but important for us as well. Is that over and over throughout the Old Testament, and beginning in the book of Genesis, what God is looking for is a repentant heart. Right? He's looking for a heart that will humble itself before Him. God isn't looking for perfect people. I think Abraham is a great example of that, right? God is not looking for perfect people, He's looking for humble people. People who will repent when necessary and put their full faith and trust in Him at all times. And so, like we talked about in Mark, the essence of faith is loyalty and allegiance. So God is teaching the people what it means to have faith in Him. And we see that through Abraham, where Abraham is the first example of that, right? In Genesis 15, it says that his faith was counted to him as righteousness. And so he is the first example of faith that we see in the book of Genesis. Somebody who is actively trying to walk with God day after day. So these are the things that God really trying to teach the nation and establish in them. And there are three things that are really important to understand for the audience that will transition into the readers as well before we make a stronger transition to the readers. So these are a lot of things that God is doing with the audience. Okay, just seeing what God's doing with them. Now, some cultural pieces. Family is of the utmost importance in the ancient world. Okay, in the ancient world of Abraham's time, cities were not grouped like they are today, where you can just have cities and roads connect them and there's no protection. Every city is walled in. Every city is protected, and usually cities operate by one person who is labeled the king. And so a king is not a king over a large territory. A king is usually a king over that city and the immediate vicinity. Okay? These are called city-states. So the protection that is provided to somebody really is only within a city. And so family is of the utmost importance when you are nomadic. So for example, someone like Abraham. living as a nomad and traveling around, having family is of the utmost importance. That's why when Abraham goes, he brings people with him. Do you find it surprising that when he goes to rescue Lot, he can bring 300 men to fight with him? You're like, where'd you get all those people? And you're like, right? That's because he's not just traveling by himself. Okay, God's calling him, but he didn't say, Abraham, like, forget everybody. He said, depart from your father's household. Right? You need to leave where your family has planted and go somewhere new. Okay? But he brings people with him. Right? People come along. And that's because they are necessary for protection. Okay? Where in the ancient world there are no standing armies. There's no regulation over land and transit and these type of things. Bandits, robbers, kind of what we refer to as like land pirates, they're going to raid, attack, capture, and kill. And so family is incredibly important for protection purposes, the people that are around you. Okay? The next really important thing is land. Okay? Land is incredibly important for the people because that is the place of their perpetuation. The place where they will be able to have some kind of location that they can grow and expand their family. And it's not like today where someone becomes an adult and they move away from home. You become an adult and you just tack on an extra room on your house, or you build them a new tent. You're still going to stay with the people, you're still going to live on the same land, you're still going to cultivate that land or have flocks on that land, but that land is your family's land. And so land is incredibly important for the people. Okay. And then the third one is descendants, family. You'll see this oftentimes throughout the Old Testament, that having descendants or having some kind of heir to the family is seen as the most important thing. More important than health and provision and security and prosperity is a descendant. Somebody to carry on the family line, somebody to take care of you when you're old, somebody to continue taking care of land, continue to look after the family. All of these types of things are encapsulated in this idea of descendants. Without descendants, you have no future. And in more of a animistic style culture where the patriarch is the high priest inside of the family, and they have kind of ancestor worship, the thought is that if ancestors are forgotten, they cease to exist in the afterlife. And so if there is nobody to honor the ancestors, then you will no longer have an afterlife. You will cease to exist because you are forgotten by everybody. But as long as you are remembered, then you will continue on. And so descendants are quite important just culturally for the people. Now, God, of course, is trying to move people away from pagan thinking and ideas, but that is one thing that is important for us to be aware of. So who are the people that it was written to? Who are these Israelites? Well, the Israelites, as we think about them, cannot be the Israelites of the New Testament. Okay, these are not Jews. Okay. The term Jew comes from the exile. Okay, so that term is much, 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 much later. The term that we want to think of them as is Israelites. But these Israelites, this OR, who has experienced the Exodus, they've seen the power of God in the plagues, they've been delivered from the Egyptians, and now they have gone through Mount Sinai, they received the law, they have the tabernacle, God's presence is in their midst. These people are the people we're talking about. Those are the experiences that they have had. They've been slaves their entire lives and have only recently been freed from slavery. But having lived in Egypt for 400 years, they would have had very little ethnic identity or national identity as a people. We see them pretty much as Egyptians. The way they think, the way they act, the way they treat God is very much Egyptian. Right? They've lived in another nation for 400 years, and they have really assimilated a lot of their cultural practices. So these were not just Israelites on a camping trip in Egypt. They were becoming part of the culture. Now, ethnically, they were different, of course. but their worldview, their religion, cultural practices, all of these types of things are very similar to the Egyptians. And so we're going to use a lot of understanding of Egyptian culture to understand their perspective and what they were thinking or going through and how they are responding to situations, or why Moses is writing certain things and how that brings correction to either ancient Mesopotamian thought or ancient Egyptian thought that would have then been a correction of their worldview. So this is a lot of what they have. Now, what that means is that they're probably polytheistic people. They're worshiping other gods in the land of Egypt, having a variety of different gods, and because of the fact that they had not received the law, the Ten Commandments, or any of the other laws yet, they're probably worshiping other gods. The law of Moses is incredibly unique in the ancient world, where it is the only law code and the only nation that banned the worship of other gods. And so up until this time, they're probably worshiping other gods. They're probably polytheistic. They also think the gods are territorial, which means they only have power over certain regions, certain spaces, and that they do not move from those locations. And so the fact that they are not in Canaan, where God has showed up to their forefather Abraham, does Yahweh still have power where we are in Egypt? And that's part of what God is showing the people in Exodus, is that God is not restricted to one location. Now, the people of Israel are really moving from this place of being polytheistic to monotheistic. But on the way, they're going to be what we refer to as henotheistic. And that's a term that means that there is one deity that is supreme above the rest, but there are still gods who deserve to be worshipped and honored for the power that they hold. That's henotheism. That'll come up on the slides later. But the people believed in territorial gods, certain gods over various aspects of society, whether that's the land or the sea or the rain or the sun or cattle, harvests, death, life, every animal, so on and so forth. And the Egyptians were incredibly religious. And we do see that while the Israelites come out of Egypt and they start to worship God, that they do still hold on to other gods. In fact, in the book of Amos, chapter 5, verse 25, it says that they continue to worship gods in the wilderness for 40 years, alongside of Yahweh. And so they definitely still have that culture inside of them. So Amos 5:25 gives us that reference. And they probably thought of God territorially. God has shown up on mountains. He showed up to Abraham on mountains or high places. He showed up to them at Mount Sinai. And the area in the land, when they conquer the Promised Land, is going to be primarily the hill country. You can see it great on this map, this topographical. This is attached to the wall. So this region here, this mountainous region and this region here, are really the only regions that Israel is going to conquer in the time of Joshua. They don't take the plains or the flatlands, and they don't take the valleys. And it's probably because their perspective of Yahweh is he is a mountain God. And so that's still their territorial mindset. They treat him that way, they think of him that way. And in the book of 1 Kings, the other nations think about God that way. They think Yahweh is a God of the mountains. And they say, their God is a God of the mountains, so we'll go fight them in the valleys. And they go and fight them in the valleys, and they get decimated. And they realize that God is much bigger than we thought he was. So Yahweh's trying to reform their minds so that they are not thinking about him like they think of the other gods. Some of the other things from the Egyptian culture that definitely play into this is this idea of Pharaoh. The name Pharaoh means the son of Ra. And so the pharaohs were seen as an embodiment of the god Ra. But they also took on kind of this representation of all of the gods of Egypt. So they stood in place of all of the gods when they went to various places. There's 42 districts in ancient Egypt. Each one of them had a different patron deity. And Pharaoh claimed to have represented all of them. And so there is kind of this perspective of the leader of the nation as the representative of God. And so that can be imposed upon Moses. Right? So for the readers, they might be thinking of him like that. And so Moses is trying to change that perspective through Genesis. And they worship all sorts of different things. I mean, we could go on and on about this, but the next thing that's just important for us to look at is that these people, the Egyptians and inevitably the Hebrews or the Israelites at this point, would have been operating inside of a class-based culture. Okay, so we cannot think about our own culture. We have to, I mean, even the first century culture, which you guys have become more familiar with, is much more similar to the ancient world of the Israelites, where there is a class system. You cannot traverse social classes. You cannot get higher, you can't go lower. Where you're born, that's where you stay. It's like a caste system in India today. That's where you are. So the people then really are thinking of themselves as the lowest class. They've been slaves their whole life. And that's their status in life. That's their perspective about themselves. That's their value system towards themselves. And because of their social class and where they've been at, they have had a bunch of security under the authority of the Egyptians. There are a plethora of studies over incarcerated criminals, which means people who've gone to jail at young ages, that if they spend a long period of time in jail at a young age, usually from the age of 16 or 17, 18 years old, until the age of 40, their reincarceration rate is over 90%. And even if they committed one crime. But most people cannot handle being free. That once they've had security and someone to tell them what to do for decades of their life, they want that back. And what you see with the Israelites is that when they have freedom, they want security. They want to go back to Egypt. We don't want to be free. We don't want to have the difficulties and challenges of being free. It's a lot harder to be free than it is to be a slave. When you know where all your meals are coming from, you know where your shelter is, you know exactly what you're doing every single day, that when you're free and you don't know where your food's coming from, you don't know where you're going, you have no idea these directions, it is a lot more challenging, especially when that's all you've known your whole life. So that's kind of their perspective here. So when you think about the readers, that's what we want to kind of keep in mind. So for the readers' questions, there's a couple of things I think are helpful for the book of Genesis, kind of their thoughts of how did we end up as slaves in Egypt? Is it because God hates us? Is it because our forefathers hate us? How did we get here? How did we get there? Did God abandon us for that period of time? How did he treat us in our history? Kind of question. Right? They've heard of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, maybe in the past, but where has God been during their 400 years? And what was kind of that purpose of that? How is God different from the Egyptian gods? A lot of these questions are being answered through the Exodus story, but there are definitely still things that would be correct in their worldview. As the saying goes, it took only days to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. So it takes a lot of time for their worldview to change. So how do I worship God? How can I please him? What happened to God's covenant with Abraham? And what promises did God make, and can you trust him to fulfill them? Now, these can be helpful leading questions for interpretation in the book of Genesis, just to give some kind of thought of where the people are at and what kind of questions they'd be asking. Not that you have to answer these questions, but that it would help to spur on some of your own questions. I'm going to move on from this slide. If you've got down a handful of them, then that's enough. So the surrounding nations, then, what are the people like in the surrounding area? Well, the Egyptians are going to be one of the primary ones, and at this point in history, they are a superpower. They are the most dominating power in this region of the world, as other nations have not yet risen up in unified mass, for example, the Assyrians or the Babylonians, who will come later. But the Egyptians really control this area of the world, and they also control Canaan. At the time of the Exodus, and for about the next 100 years or so, they do have an invested say in this land. Prior to the Exodus as well, they had controlled this region. Now, when an empire controls a region, they do not occupy that Okay? In the ancient world, nobody had money for standing armies. So it's not like you go there and you leave an army there, or soldiers to maintain order and maintain them following your rule. What you do is you make a treaty with them, and you say, you will give us food, you'll send us tribute, money, you'll send us people to be either workers or slaves or something like that, and in return, we will protect you. And they say, if you break that agreement, then we'll come up and we'll destroy you. And so you can either do it and live, or don't and be killed. And that's how they would do it. So if you can't leave soldiers, you make a treaty, and then that's why you're going to see throughout the Old Testament, Judah and Israel are going to be attacked, and then they become a vassal to another nation. And when they become a vassal, the nation doesn't occupy their land, but they do have to serve that nation. Okay? So Egypt never didn't occupy this land, but they controlled the land through treaties. And we have these ancient letters written from this land to Egypt that says, hey, people are coming and attacking us, please come and help. And the Egyptians are like, nah, you're okay on your own. And they kind of leave them to it. But of course, they're incredibly powerful. We'll learn a lot more about the Egyptians as we go along, their worldview and things like that. But with the Canaanites, the political operation of the land of Canaan is as city-states. So each one of the cities operates as its own government. So there is not really a unifying government in this land. This map is later, of course, because you can see the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel, the split kingdom. But the Canaanites all operate in various city-states and as different people groups. The religious system in the land of Canaan has found its origins in the Hittite culture, as the Hittites, who are from eastern Turkey, had invaded this land and occupied it prior to the Egyptians. They had brought down many of their own gods. And so the Canaanite pantheon, which is made up of roughly about 70 gods, comes from the Hittite culture. So Baal, Asherah, Ashtoreth, El, all of these gods come from the Hittite culture. And just like the Egyptians, they're very animistic in that there is a god for everything. And they worship these gods through a variety of different means, including animal sacrifices, drink offerings, ritualistic cutting, where they will cut themselves in worship of the gods. There are very sexually depraved acts of worship, which are referred to as sympathetic magic. You guys learn about that in the New Testament? The sympathetic magic is the act that if you do something in a sanctuary or ritually ordained location, that your actions will influence the gods to do the same thing. That's called sympathetic magic. Okay. So what they would do is there would be cult prostitutes at the temple of Baal or Asherah, and the priests or the people would come and they would have sex with the cult prostitutes, trying to influence the gods of the crops and fertility to then have sex themselves to produce fertile crops for the land. And so that's sympathetic magic. Okay, so that kind of worship of the gods to try to provoke them into some kind of response is what we look at as the very depraved acts of worship. On top of that, they're also offering child sacrifices to Molech in the land as well. So there are a lot of things that are incredibly depraved about their worship system and about their value system in general. The people, though, are agricultural people. They have crops and vineyards. They tend flocks and those type of things. And so that's their main kind of mode of operation. So they're very, very similar to what the Israelites will be, and like Abraham as well. And so when you are a farmer and there is no government to take care of you, your crops are your only form of security every single year. You can't store wealth in the bank. It's not like you can keep money and buy food if there's a famine. Right? If there's no food, there's no food. The government can't provide for you. And so, how can you secure your good crops every single year? Well, I've got to make sure I'm worshiping the God of this land who's going to give me good crops. Because if I don't worship him, and I have bad crops, then my whole family is in danger. Right? That's a big deal, right? And so for the Israelites, eventually coming into this land, they're like, okay, we got to make sure we worship the gods of this land because they're territorial deities. And if we don't worship him, he's going to curse us, that we're going to have bad crops, we're going to suffer and die. So just to cover all of our bases, we'll just worship him just in case. Because he will be mad at us and judge us if we don't worship him, right? But if we don't worship him and just worship Yahweh, then we're in danger, right? So it's this kind of tug of war in their ancient worldview and perspective. Now God says, I will provide for you, I will take care of you. But their worldview is so ingrained inside of them. So that's kind of the worldview here. So everything revolves around year-to-year security, which is why the sabbatical year in the law will become such a difficulty for the people. How can you take one full year and not plant any crops? That's like suicide. It requires incredible levels of faith in God to do something like that. Where God will say, I will provide for you. And in the seventh year, you don't plant any crops. Which means that you don't eat for basically 2 years. And God has to provide for 2 years' worth of food. Because you don't plant in the seventh year, that means you don't harvest anything in the eighth year either. So, God's asking for incredible levels of faith for the people. But we see kind of that's their mindset and perspective in their agricultural culture. And the reason that Canaan was such a strong location and such an ideal location for the people of Israel is because it was a location of major trade routes between Africa and Asia. So you have, it's the only land crossing between Africa and Asia. Everything else is sea crossing. And so the roads of the land of Canaan were always the places that armies would march and that traders would travel. And so it is the perfect location to put God's people, because all of the nations of the world will come to him, to Israel, right? Because they're going to trade. And so the people come to Israel, they see these amazing people, and then they're able to take the report and tell other people about it. So the Promised Land is the ideal location for a light for all of the nations. So I'm going to put up this next slide just as I know you guys are working on your horizontal, but just talk about structure a little bit with the book here. The book is pretty clearly formatted and laid out quite vividly and clear for us. We see the history of humanity in the first 11 chapters, which focuses on all of creation and the history of all of humanity. And then from chapter 12, it's going to narrow down to the history of the Hebrew people. And so we get this story of the human race and the Hebrew race. And inside of that, there are these 4 events that are highlighted with the human race. These events being creation, human rebellion, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, that are the main push of those sections. And then we have these 4 people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And they carry on the story and are the focus throughout the second half of the book and how the book flows. Now, when you consider the fact that Joseph has as much time as Abraham has in this book, space-wise, it's a good question to ask, well, why? Okay. This is a helpful question to ask for your horizontal for the Old Testament. Why is time devoted to this conversation or to this subject? So why do you guys think Joseph gets the most time when he's not even a patriarch and he doesn't even receive the promises from God?
Would it help let the readers know why they are where they are?
Yeah, I think so. Right? For the original readers, how did we get here? Was it through somebody's ill intentions? No. It's because Joseph wanted to preserve the people. Right? God wanted to save you. What man meant for evil, God intended for good. You know, so that's this real push. And so if you've divided your book into 3 divisions, where you have chapters 1 through 11, and then you have the patriarchs, chapters 12 through 37, and then you have Joseph at the end. That's another way to divide the book well, as the focus of Joseph is not on the patriarchal promises, but more on the relocation from the land of Canaan to Egypt. Okay, so there's a few important aspects for the book of Genesis just to be aware of as, on the broad spectrum of things. And that is first historical. That the book is about real people in real places, and these are real historical events. Okay, so that's one element that we want to keep in mind as primary aspect of this book. The next is that there are things that are symbolic in this book, and these things will be pretty clear to us. We're not trying to impose symbols on anything, okay? But we're looking to say, is there anything the author's trying to present as a symbol? For example, Adam. The name Adam is used as a proper name today, but the word Adam just means humanity. Okay, so the first man, when his name is humanity, is a symbol for all of humanity. Okay, so it is his name that kind of gives that away to us. Abraham, what does Abraham's name mean? The father of many, or the father of a multitude. Okay? So, when he's told his descendants will be as the stars in the sky, and that a nation will come from him, and his name is a father of a multitude, then you want to understand him as the father of Israel. Okay, so he's a person, but he symbolically represents the father of the whole nation of Israel. Okay? So these kind of symbolic figures that come up are not things that are imposed from the outside, but they're things that we would observe in the text and begin to draw kind of a conclusion about how they are presented in the scriptures themselves. The final one is an apologetic. Okay, this is very significant for the first 11 chapters of this book, is that it is apologetic in nature, which means that it is intentionally trying to correct worldview. So, Moses is very intentionally trying to change the thinking of the people. And to show them how they should be looking at the history of the book. Okay, so let's transition to talk about historical narrative now, as this is a good segue into literature. So historical narrative is a very important type of literature for the Bible, as historical narrative makes up 40% of the Old Testament, and 3/4 of the whole Bible is the Old Testament. Okay, so it is a predominating type of literature in the Bible, and thus we should pay special attention to the key factors of this type of literature. So when we look at the large and smaller historical narrative books, we see most of our books from Genesis through Chronicles are going to be, or through Nehemiah before Job, are going to be historical narrative books. And then we do have other books that are smaller or have a mix of things. So, for example, Exodus has a lot of law literature and narrative, and Numbers the same thing, and Jeremiah has a lot of prophecy, Ezekiel, Isaiah, but they also have some narrative portions as well. So, I have Isaiah twice. And then and Job as well has some narrative at the beginning and the end. Now, when we think about historical narrative, some of the things we want to keep in mind is that historical narrative is trying to make you a part of the bigger picture of the story. Okay, so it's trying to give a big picture look. And when we read historical narrative, the most common thing that is trying to be communicated is what not to do. Okay? So this is an incredibly important point for the Bible. Right? Is some people will say, well, it's biblical because it's in the Bible. Okay, that does not make it right, or that you should do it just because it's in the Bible. Most of the time, the stories are telling you what you should not do, not what you should do. And this leads to a very important point. Every author in the Old Testament expects that their readers understand the law of Moses. They expect that the readers know what God has communicated, his expectations for the people. And so that when they read these stories, they're like, oh, actually, they should not have done that. They should have done this. That was the wrong way to respond. Okay? So they're not going to tell you what should have happened or what could have happened or what would have happened. They're going to tell you what did happen. And most of the time it's not what we want to do. Which is where Paul will draw on that point in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 6 and 11, where he will say that the Old Testament stories are given so that we will have examples and so that we will know what not to do. Okay? So that's 1 Corinthians 10, 6, and 11. So there are three levels of historical narrative. The top level, which is going to be the overarching level for all historical narrative, and that is that it is God's story. So from Genesis all the way through the end of the Old Testament, this is God's story. This is the overarching narrative for everything, the top level. And then the middle level is going to be the story of Israel. Okay, so we've got God's story, which is going to interact with various nations. The middle level of the narrative is going to be that of Israel. Okay, and that's going to tie in a lot of the stories together. And then the lowest level is going to be the individual narratives about people or about tribes or something like that. So these are going to help to tie back into each level. So all of these levels tie together and contribute to one another. And it is the big story that gives the little stories meaning. There are 5 basic components to all narrative. And these 5 basic components are first a narrator. Okay. Now, Hebrew literature is quite unique in the narration. The narrator in Hebrew literature is going to be the one who controls inclusion and omission, which means they are the one who decides what's written about and what's not written about. And so when you wish that you had more information on something, you can just wait to talk to Moses. The Hebrew narrative is quite unique, though, in that most Hebrew narrative is anonymous. And it's written by a seemingly omniscient third-person narrator. That person seems to know everything about everything. The heart intentions of individuals, their ambitions, and what is going to happen. Now, we see that narrative strategy of anonymous, omniscient authors in other ancient Near Eastern cultures as well. But the unique thing about Hebrew literature is it is almost exclusively in that style. So pretty much every narrative book in the Old Testament will be written from this anonymous, omniscient third-person perspective. And so it begins to sound like it is God himself that is communicating the story, even knowing the thoughts of the characters. The next element is a plot. Every story has a plot, and this is the kind of the skeleton that a story is stretched over. Okay, so a good plot line is a conflict to resolution. We, as humans, we love conflict to resolution. It is one of the most well-selling plot lines for all of human history, whether that's in novels or movies, or dramas or plays, theater, musicals. Conflict to resolution is primarily how we communicate our stories. And that's going to be how the Old Testament authors are going to lay out their stories as well. They will start with the setting, and then they will lay out the conflict, and then they will move to a resolution. The characters in the stories are really important to pay attention to. Now, we call them characters, but that doesn't diminish their historical significance or reality. Okay? They are real people. They have real experiences, real lives. We just get very small glimpses of their lives. But one of the things that you will notice as a significant difference from characters described in books today versus characters described in the Bible is that you know almost nothing about what they look like. Pretty much any book you read today is going to describe what the characters look like to you. In the Old Testament, and in the Bible in general, they're really not going to care that much what people look like. Okay. They're going to be more concerned with the character of the character than the visual representation or description of the character. So what that means is that when a character is visually described, it is often incredibly significant for the story. It's not a random detail. So, when you find out that Sarah is exceedingly beautiful, that is used as a plot device for the story. Okay? It's not just some random detail about Sarah. And when we learn about characters, we will often not learn about them in the way that we talk about characters in stories today, where we will describe them and we will go into extensive detail of their description of actions. The way you get to know characters in the Old Testament is more by the dialogue than by the description, okay? Which makes paying attention to dialogue the most important observation you can make about people, okay? So it's not as important to know who they are or how they're talked about as much as what they say. Because what they say will show you what they believe, what they think, how they understand God, how they understand the relationships around them. So pay attention to the dialogue. It's very, very important. And then, of course, there are scenes. Okay? These can be scenes that blend together, stories that blend together, or set apart as individual narratives to build as building blocks for the whole book. Okay. There's 4 things I want to highlight about narratives that they are not. Okay? So narratives are not stories only about people. The thing that's important to remember is that God is the supreme protagonist through the entirety of the Scriptures. Narratives are not allegories filled with hidden meaning. So it's not that there's some deeper spiritual meaning behind everything. We've got to search it out and find out all of the hidden meaning in the Scriptures. And so we want to be careful to not read into the text what is not there. Narratives are not always teaching directly. So you're not always going to get a moral to the story. But it gives us a hands-on knowledge of what God is doing in the world. And a lot of the times, the teaching point is going to be implicit, not explicit. So it's going to be something that's kind of just in there, and you have to pull it out. But not every narrative will have a moral all its own. Okay? Sometimes narratives will just be there to move the story along. Or a genealogy might just be in there to move along the story. And you may not have, like the New Testament, where you could pull a moral truth out of every line in an epistle. You know, every sentence there's something, and sometimes there's multiple things you can pull out of a single sentence in an epistle. In an Old Testament narrative, there might be one truth for the whole story that is trying to be taught. And so what we want to be careful of is to be good Bible students of the literature and not read into historical narrative our epistle tendencies. So we're not trying to search for truths in every line and everything they say. What's the timeless truth of everything they say? But more, what is the truth of the story? What's this trying to communicate about God? What are they trying to teach from this whole dialogue? And so you'll have to train your mind to think a little bit more big picture. If you try to engage with historical narrative in the Old Testament like you do with New Testament epistles or even New Testament gospel narrative, then you will suffer this quarter. You have got to transition in how you think, to think more big picture, to focus more on dialogue than on the details, and to look at how everything ties together. And it's going to be more helpful, instead of looking at the details of a story, to say, how does this story contribute to the other stories around them? How does this story contribute to the whole context of the book? And what is this book trying to communicate as a whole? And so having your main idea and reason written and having your horizontal in front of you while you are charting will be incredibly helpful. Because thinking big picture is what the authors are doing with historical narrative. And so all of the little stories are contributing to the bigger picture of this book. Just a couple more things as reminder points on historical narrative here that I want to highlight before we transition into talking about Genesis chapters 1 through 3. So as reminders, historical narrative is not about what should have happened. It's about what did happen. Not every individual story has an identifiable moral. And when you are not told what the moral is, it should be pretty obvious what it is. Frequently, the examples are bad examples, not good ones. And most of the characters are far from perfect, which is totally different from ancient Near Eastern writing. One of the things that ancient Near Eastern writing is notorious for is embellishment. That they only record what was good about them. And so all the characters only ever do good things, they never mess up. Okay? So in the ancient world, kings are their own greatest propaganda for themselves, right? They never record anything bad. They only record the successful things in their reign. For example, okay, Egypt rarely gets invaded. But in this period of time called the Second Intermediate Period, an Asiatic people comes and they conquer the land of Egypt and they occupy Egypt. In Egyptian chronology and records, there is no record of this. But after about 150 years, they start winning battles in their own land. And they start taking back their own land. And you're like, well, how did that happen? You wrote nothing about that, right? And that's because they don't write about their losses, only their victories. So even if it's victories in their own land that kind of imply that they had losses, they are still going to portray them as victories. Or, for example, Sennacherib, who's going to come up and attack Jerusalem in 701 BC. In the book of Isaiah and also 2 Kings, it tells us that Sennacherib's army suffered a loss of 185,000 soldiers, and that he went back to his home in Assyria, and then that he had died in the temple through an assassination. In the Assyrian records, Sennacherib says that he had conquered all of these cities throughout Judah. He had sacked many of them and taken many slaves, and he came to Jerusalem, and he hemmed up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage. And then he went home. That was it. Nothing else. He doesn't record any of his losses, that his army was decimated. But the other nations around record that his army was destroyed, not just the Bible. Okay? So Greek records record that his army was destroyed. So these type of things, that's how the ancients talked about their nation. So the fact that the Bible tells us all of the faults and failures of the characters is absolutely unheard of. But what does that tell us? It shows us the goodness of God. Right? That God works with broken people. That God isn't trying to gloss over people's failures. That he's trying to show the goodness of his character despite man's mess-ups. As well, historical narratives are going to be incomplete, and they will be selective. You're not always going to get the answers to the questions you have or the extra information that you want. And these stories are not written necessarily to answer theological questions. Sometimes these stories are just written to answer historical questions. How did something happen? Why is it this way? So, for example, the rape of Dinah and the attack of Shechem by Levi and Simeon may not have a theological truth behind it, because the story is there to tell you why neither of them receive inheritance and why both of them are cursed by Jacob in chapter 49. So these type of stories, sometimes they're just in there to help you understand other parts of the story. And so they might teach explicitly or implicitly, but at the end of the day, the most important thing to remember is that God is the hero. All right, any questions or anything for the past about 45 minutes? All right, let's take a 5-minute break. So we'll start back just about 11:40, and we'll go until 12:30. Okay, so with all of the background stuff, or a lot of it, out of the way, We'll cover a number of things as we go through the book as well, so you'll want to pay attention to that and add those in as you go along, because some of the things that I'll talk about background-wise will just be pertinent to the moment, and so they're helpful to add into your BRI later. So the best place to start in Genesis is chapter 1, right at the beginning. And one of the first things that we notice at the beginning is that there are some differences between Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. One of them records a 7-day creation story, and then one of them records seemingly another creation story, but does not have a length of time with it. Right? In chapter 1, we see the beginning of God's creation, and then in chapter 2, it says in verse 5, when no bush of the field was yet on the land. You're like, well, wait a second, I thought God just made everything in the land in chapter 1. Okay, so we wind up with some discrepancy here, where we've got to deal with what is going on. And so a lot of kind of the first few chapters of this book are going to be, first 11 chapters are going to be answering a lot of questions. Okay, so that's mostly what we'll do in the first 11 chapters or so. And so there's a few different thoughts that people propose, and that is that the Bible isn't necessarily trying to give a scientific description of the origins of the universe in chapter 1, but is trying to give kind of just a deeper theological meaning. And so that doesn't necessarily discount the fact that God created the earth, but just that may not be what the point of this story is. The other suggestions is that that the Bible has it right, and that science is wrong on how the earth was created, and that's just skepticism towards the scientific approach to Scripture, or that both of these can be united, right? Whether one is right or one is wrong is not necessarily the point, as much as trying to read them both correctly or both understand both correctly. So we're looking at the biblical account. We understand that it's not trying to give a scientific understanding of the origins of the universe like we are asking the question about it. I mean, Moses was not concerned about the origins of the universe the same way that people are today. The ancients did not seem to care that much about how it happened, but about who is in charge is the bigger question for them, okay? Because their whole life revolves around the worship of gods who are over various portions of creation. And so for them, it wasn't about where it came from as much as who controlled it. So throughout history, there's been a lot of people who have both agreed and disagreed with a 6-day creation story, and that is exactly how it happened. A lot of people have agreed, and then there's people who have said that it's a figurative 6 days, and that it may not have happened exactly in 6 24-hour periods. Some notable people would be C.S. Lewis or Augustine, who did not hold to that perspective. But whether it happened in 6 days or not does not negate the fact that God created the earth from nothing. Okay? So regardless of how people will look at Genesis chapter 1, the rest of the Old Testament does clearly affirm that God is the creator of all things, and that he had created them from nothing. The term that's commonly used is a Latin one, ex nihilo, or ex nihilo. The term means created from nothing. Okay, so that's the perspective. Now, why would we think that Genesis 1 might not be that way? Well, we want to think of it from the ancient Egyptian perspective, not from our perspective of 21st century questions. Okay. So, when the ancients are looking at something like this, how is Genesis 1 organized? Well, there's a number of different ways that people have proposed its organization. One of those is like an ancient temple. That Genesis chapter 1 lays out creation like a temple picture would for the Egyptians. When the Egyptians make a temple for their gods, they lay out the location, they set apart the land for the temple, they plant a garden in the temple precincts, they fill it with various things and build the building, and the last thing they put inside of the temple is the statue of the god whose temple it is. And so Genesis chapter 1 has been compared to a kind of a temple origin story, and that creation is God's temple. It's the place where he wants to dwell and set his people as his representatives on the 6th day. And that could be one perspective of what God is doing in creation. And why would they care about that? Why would that matter? Because the question for the ancients is not as much where did everything come from, but how should we understand it? What's the purpose of creation? Okay? We are more concerned with the origin of creation. But throughout history, the purpose question has been much more important. Okay? So why? Why is it here? What is it for? What do we do with it? Rather than where did it come from? And it shows a lot about our worldview, the type of questions we're asking. Because when we're not asking about purpose, it shows that we really don't care about the purpose. We don't think there's a purpose. In fact, Darwinian evolution will say that there is not an inherent purpose in creation because it just happened. When you think of a creator, then there is a purpose. When things just happen randomly, they don't have a purpose. They are as purposeless as it possibly gets because there was no origin for them. Okay? So the fact that we're asking questions about how rather than why shows us that we really don't care that much about the why question as a human race. Maybe not you guys in this room, but just in general. So their questions are more about why and what than where or how. So the temple idea is one possible way. But again, thinking about from the ancient perspective, we want to think about these people being Egyptians. How would they have understood and what kind of would be their perspective on the world and the creation or the purpose of it, the origins of man and what they're created for. And what we see in Genesis chapter 1 is the purpose of man given at the end of the chapter, whereas in chapter 2 we get the origins of man really told, right? In chapter 1 it just says God created man, verse 27. In chapter 2 it tells us how God created man, right? But in chapter 1 the whole point is to say this is the purpose of humanity. And if you notice, in each one of the days, what is given is not just the origins of something, but what it is for. Okay, what's the purpose of these things? So people ask the question, how can sun be created after light? Well, it's not that God is creating the sun later. It's that he's giving light purpose first before he gives the sun, moon, and stars purpose. So we can look at each one of these days as we go through. But with Egyptian worldview, their perspective, right? We talk about local deities and how there are deities over all sorts of different aspects of creation. We talked about this perspective of this monotheistic, henotheistic, and polytheistic ideas that the people of Egypt were polytheistic. Israel was probably a polytheistic people until they come out and receive the law, and then they begin to move towards monotheism, but really kind of get hung up in henotheism for a number of centuries. Their perspective on gods in the lands and at the time is really that the more powerful a nation's gods are, the more powerful the nation is, or vice versa. The more powerful the nation is, the more powerful their gods are, because inherently the gods are powerful. Okay. And they look at a larger pantheon of gods as leading to a greater understanding of the power of that nation. So the fact that Egypt has so many gods they're worshiping and honoring shows why they are prospering so heavily. So if you have a god that's now telling you not to worship any other gods, that seems to be to your detriment. Right? Because what about all those gods I'm not honoring and how they're going to judge me and hate me? They're going to destroy my crops. They're going to destroy my land. They're going to kill my family. All the things that could possibly happen from the gods that you're not worshiping. Okay? Because you've decided to only worship one. So what was the belief for the Egyptians? Okay, this is kind of the ancient Egyptian cosmology. This is how they viewed the world. Okay. This is how the ancient Hebrews viewed the world as well, but not through the perspective of God. So we'll show a picture of what their kind of perspective was. But it's very similar to this. Okay? So what you see is things like the god Geb, who is the god of the earth, and he is down on the ground, and the goddess Nut, who is the goddess of the sky, which is why she has all the stars over her, And then the various gods that sail through the sky over the day, that bring the day with them, and then the gods from the night sailing over the sky in the night. Okay? What you notice is a separation, in this kind of what we refer to as the firmament, or the separation of water from waters kind of idea, which we'll see here, is the earth is flat, and there's a dome over the earth. Okay? So, this is the biblical perspective of the earth. People who would try to read into the text a spherical understanding of the world would be misreading the biblical text. Because the ancient perspective of the origins and cosmology is that the earth is flat and that there is a dome over the earth. Okay, both from the Hebrew perspective and from the ancient world perspective. But they didn't know any better. And it doesn't seem like God cares very much. He's not trying to correct them. And it maybe shows us a little bit of what priorities are on God's part. He's not so much concerned about them having everything factually correct as having a correct understanding of who He is. Which goes against our post-Enlightenment perspective that we think that knowledge makes us better. The smarter we are, the more we know, the more accurate our knowledge is, the better people we can be. Which is not necessarily true. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying we should be dumb. So the creation or the origin story for the people of Egypt, one of them, there's a variety of them, but one of them called the Memphite Theology, or Memphite Cosmology, is the only one that in the ancient world that also has a record of a God speaking things and making them happen. All the other ones are done by action. Okay, so we want to compare this and parallel it a little bit here. This comes from the city of Memphis, which is in modern day, or just outside of modern day Cairo, and pretty close to the Great Pyramids of Giza. So in the beginning, before there was anything else, there were the waters of chaos, named Nu. And out of Nu arose a dry hill, and by sheer force of will, Atum Ra created himself. And he said, I am the maker of heaven and earth. I'm the builder of the mountains. I'm the source of the waters throughout the entire world. I'm the light and darkness. I am the creator of the great river Egypt. I am the kindler of fire that burns in the sky. And the sun rose and passed across the sky, and it was the first day. To Ra was given the ability to create all of the other gods who brought control to all areas of the world. He created Shu to be the goddess over the winds, and as he called her into existence, the winds blew across the land for the first time. He placed Nut over the sky and the firmament to be the one who upholds all of the stars in the sky and keeps them from falling upon the earth. He placed Geb as the god over the land to provide fertility for the land, and Happy as the god over the Nile River, which flowed through the middle of the land, watering the Egyptian, or the Nile River delta. And last of all, after all of the gods had been created and all of the land had been subdued and every part of creation or every part of the earth had been taken care of, the last of all to be created was man. And man was created in a moment of weakness where Ra was weeping over his present state of affairs, and as his tears fell from his eyes and landed upon the dirt of the earth, it turned into humans. And Ra placed himself over as king over all of the people that he had created, making himself the first pharaoh. He reigned for 1,000 years, and through the various unions of other gods and goddesses, a new god was born, Isis. And Isis was the most wise and cunning of all of the gods and wanted to have the understanding that Ra did of all of the secret names of the other gods. Now, no one knew Ra's secret name except Ra. All of the gods knew their own secret names. You could think back to first century perspective where they're trying to find the secret names of the gods to try to call upon them and control them, right? So Isis was trying to do the same thing towards Ra. Now, as Ra grew old and wandered across the earth, Isis put out a cobra in front of him, which bit him on the heel and led to his death. And as he died, he passed down into the underworld where he conquered the serpent, Epiphorus. And as he conquered the serpent and rose into the sky the next morning, there was a sunrise. And Ra now was placed in the sky for all time, where he would cross the land in the day, and every night would travel to the underworld to battle Epiphorus, the snake of the underworld, every single night until he would raise victorious again in the morning and cross again over the sky. So this is kind of one of the Egyptian cosmological stories, is that of how things came into the order. Okay, so this is not how things came to exist, but how things were placed into control and order. So Ra is ordering creation. And this is kind of how the Hebrews would have viewed the earth. Okay, so we've got the land and then the sea around the land and the pillars that uphold the earth and shale under there. And then we've got this firmament. And we've got the waters above and the waters below. And that's their ancient perspective on it. And we have God who is above the heavens of the heavens. Why would you think that that there's this firmament here? Right? Because when you look out at the sky, it seems domed. You live on a flat land like Egypt, and it looks just like everything is in a dome. Right? That's the perspective. No matter where and how far you go, it seems like you're always inside of that dome. Right? And the stars are thought to move across the sky, not be stationary. But because we know now the earth moves and the stars are all fixed. In the ancient world, they thought the earth was stationary and the stars were moving across the sky. And so they thought the stars were gods in the sky. And the planets were the powerful gods, like the sun being Ra, that's moving across the sky every day, or the moon, or the planets out like Jupiter, which becomes the king star, and represents Zeus or Jupiter in the Roman and Greek pantheon as the most powerful one in the sky. And so that's kind of the cosmological perspective for the people in the ancient world. So when we think about Genesis chapter 1, and think about this story from the Memphite cosmology, we can think of other stories as well. Okay? In other ancient stories that talk about the ordering of the world, the ordering of the world is always seen as the gods either allocating other areas to different gods, or putting them in charge of those things. And the gods are the ones who control all of the land. Now, in every cosmological story, mankind is always an accident. There's not a single story where mankind is an intentional creation. There's a handful of them, so we've got this one where Ra cries and his tears create mankind accidentally. There's another story from ancient Mesopotamia where two gods are fighting with each other and one cuts the other one in half, and the blood from that god lands upon the soil and creates humanity. There's another one where two gods are having sex, and as the male god finishes, pulls out, and his semen becomes dropped on the ground and becomes mankind on the earth. And so these various origin stories from the ancient world all portray man as an accident. And in the ancient world, they thought the gods viewed humanity as a nuisance. There was no ancient culture that thought the gods liked humanity. The only reason that they took care of humanity was because humanity would burn sacrifices to them, and that was the only way they could get their food. So the ancients believed that their sacrifices to the gods was a way of feeding the gods. And if the gods didn't get their food, then they became awful hangry. And that's where your judgment comes. So you better offer your sacrifices, you better keep them satiated. Okay? So the only reason that the gods kept humans around was because of that. And this will tie into a flood story as well. So with Genesis chapter 1, what we see at the beginning is that the Egyptian cosmological story starts out with these gods that are kind of creating themselves. With the Genesis story, God is alone at the beginning, and he is the one who's doing everything. He's the one who's setting everything in motion and in order. Right? He is not doing it with the help of anybody else. And as he is creating, God is giving order to all of the world. So as he's creating light, he says, let there be light. Right? And as there was light, God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And he called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Okay? He is giving purpose to the function of the day. Okay? And then you get down into the third day, the fourth day. God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let there be signs for seasons, for days, and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. Now, it's not that there wasn't light before this time. It's that now God is giving appointment to those lights. This is what they're for. This is why they are in the sky. Okay, so he's giving purpose to everything. Now, this plays in with the ideas of the words that are being used. Bara is the word that is being used for this creation activity. And this word more often conveys the idea of determining function or ordering something than it does in suggesting creation of something that has never existed before. And that plays with the same idea of formless and void, which at the beginning of this passage, where we see that the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the earth, that being formless and void is not so much about non-existence, but more about non-functional, barren state. Right? The earth is there, but it's barren. It has no function. And the only other time this appears in conjunction with each other is Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23, where it portrays the same kind of idea, where things are moving into a state of dysfunction. And so you can think kind of like an idea of a factory. So if you think of a factory that has been built, it has all of the machinery, all the walls are there, but it's not producing anything. It's just there. In the purest sense of the word, it exists. But it's not doing anything. There's no function. So it doesn't exist to the fullest extent of the term. It doesn't exist to fulfill its purpose. And what God is doing is he's giving purpose to the world. And so he is establishing all aspects of creation for their purpose. What should they do? And this is very, very significant, you guys, because it tells us what God's intention for creation was. Okay? I think probably the most important question for us is not how the world was created. We know God created it. The bigger question for us is, why did he create it? And what did he want with everything he created? Right? That's one of the biggest questions we ask with our lives. What's our calling? What does God intend for me to do? What do you want me to do, God? Where do you want me to go? We're always asking purpose questions to God. And that's what he did with creation. He set out the purpose of creation. And he set out the purpose of mankind. This is what mankind is for at the end of the chapter in verses 27 through the rest of it. Now, with a number of things in here, we see, for example, the creation of, or the ordering of light before the sun. And there's a number of things in here that undermine the Egyptian gods, right? We see the fact that God is in control of everything. He does it alone. There's no other gods he puts over anything. He's the one who appoints everything. He's in complete control. And as he creates his creation, he sees that it is very good. That throughout each one of the days, his response is that it is good. Now, this word good is not a moral goodness. The word good is a working goodness. This works correctly. So he appoints something, he purposes it, and he says it's working well. Okay, so we often think that this is a moral goodness. So the word here is not morality. But when he makes mankind, what is his response? What does God say on the sixth day of creation? It is very good. Right? This is exactly the way that it should be. And what does that teach about humanity? To an Israelite people who are Egyptian thinkers, in their ancient context, to see that all of earth is functioning as well as it should be, and then on the very last day when humanity is put on the earth, that they are called very good, that is completely opposite of what every other nation was thinking. God looks at humanity and says, this is the best part. This is exactly the way that it should be. And what it presents to us is that humanity is the pinnacle of God's creation. Instead of all the other nations that have accidental origin stories of humanity, where did humans come from? That every single one of them being an accident, you have the Bible which shows intention, that God had a desire for his people. So as they have a desire, as God has a desire for them and an intention for them and a purpose for them, this should teach them that as the pinnacle of God's creation, they should not worship anything else. That to worship nature is to submit themselves to something that they are greater than. Right? It's a dismissing of the status that God has naturally given them as human beings. So why worship the sun, the moon, the stars, the sky, when you have been made greater than all of those things? So it just establishes incredible levels of value with them. The next question that often comes up is this created in the image of God question, right? Where God says, or it says, so God created man in his own image. Okay, well, what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God, as it says in verse 28? There's all sorts of suggestions for this that people give. For example, people suggest some kind of physical appearance. We see God talked about with anthropomorphic terms. Jesus takes on human flesh. And so is there some kind of physical appearance similarity in an image? Because that's what an image is. An image is a representation of something else in a physical form. Or does it mean three parts, that we are spirit, soul, and body? Or is it that we're under the authority, placed under the authority of God to be his image? Or that we will reflect his personality? All of these are good suggestions, but none of them take into consideration the historical context. And most of the time, our conversation about being the image of God is one that is not contextual. We take it and we try to determine it based on what we think it is. Okay, so let's look at some context for this. Historically and literarily, where is the word image used in the Old Testament? How is this word used elsewhere? In the book of Genesis and in the rest of the Old Testament and in the Pentateuch by Moses. The word image most commonly is used for idols. It's the most common word used to describe an idol. Now, that makes a ton of sense when considering the fact that Egyptian temple organization always placed the idol last. And for God making his creation, ordering his temple to place his idol last in the temple is incredibly important. As Israel then, or all of humanity, is meant to be representatives of God, what does that tell you about things like Pharaoh? Well, Pharaoh, being the claimed embodiment or representative of all of the gods, now has no supremacy over humanity as a whole in their worldview. Now that they see the value of every individual to be the representative of God. Right? That each individual person is meant to be carrying that perspective of representing God well. And of course, we are not to be worshipped like an idol, and it's not the same concept, right? This is not idolatry of the ancient world. Idols are meant to be representatives, right? When you see the idol, you've seen the God, right? And that's kind of how humanity is portrayed as in this setting, is that they are God's representative on his behalf because they take care of his creation. And just like priests in the Egyptian temples were directed and allocated by the gods to take care of the space that the gods were calling home, so humanity is now given the responsibility to take care of the place that God had desired to call home with his people. And this calls in the whole role of being a priest as an individual, right? Being a representative. The priests were to be representatives between God and man and God, right, in the ancient world. And so now, with humanity being God's representatives on the earth, they are to be that towards creation. And so we see that kind of parallel taking place here, potentially. And so, man is created together, right? It says he created humanity, male and female, he created them. And so the first understanding of humanity is equality. That both men and women were created together and side by side and equal. Right? We'll see how that story plays out in chapter 2. But Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 is the initial verse that gives us the understanding of man and woman together and of that equal standard. So the whole point of the story shows God's purpose behind all of creation and his character and his nature in doing so, that he has nobody next to him. He is surely alone. There's no other gods he shares power with, and he has complete control over every area of the world. So then, chapter 2, as we kind of step back again to recreation, to start over, we open up with this line, these are the generations of. Okay, so this is the first Toledot in the book, and it is the first of the origin stories, or the first of kind of these stories. And so the interesting thing is that the Toledot always starts with the prior generation. Okay, so it's not these are the generations of Abraham, it's these are the generations of Terah. Or chapter 37, verse 2, it's not these are the generations of Joseph, it says these are the generations of Jacob, and then it goes into Joseph's story. And so it's quite interesting then that this one starts with these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And then it will go into the story of mankind. Okay, so it kind of starts with, quote, the previous generation here of the heavens and the earth. Now, the perspective then on this second creation story leaves us with many questions. Where is the garden? Was it around? Was it a physical place? Was it a full garden area? And one of the interesting things just about the ancient Mesopotamian world is that many geologists today agree upon the fact that at one point in human history that the entire North African region was a lush jungle land. And that at some point there had been either climate change or some dramatic catastrophic event that changed the terrain and leveled the whole area to now be a desert area. And so the region that is known as the Fertile Crescent, that stretches from the Euphrates and then down through Israel and then into North Africa, across all of North Africa, was at one time a lush jungle land. So it is not too far-fetched to think that this could have been an actual place that just no longer exists because of geographical changes in that region of the world. But what we see with this picture, regardless of the geographical location of it, is the images that it is meant to portray for a people who've come from an ancient perspective, an ancient worldview. So what we see with the Egyptian perspective is they viewed the Nile as the source of all life, and the Nile flowed through the land and it watered all the land in Egypt. And even to this day, Egypt only lives on 7% of their geographical land. even to this day, 7% of their entire land space is lived on, and it's all centralized around the Nile River. They don't live anywhere else. Okay? So in the ancient world, it was the same thing. Everybody lived around the Nile River. They viewed it as the source of life. And so when you have these 4 rivers flowing through the Garden of Eden, and they are watering the land, they are seen kind of as these images of life. Right? They are the ones giving life. And garden imagery in the ancient world is incredibly prevalent when talking about the location of deities and their dwelling place. Pretty much every god of the ancient world is described as dwelling in a garden. Or the Egyptians, when they built their temples, they made them into gardens. You know, when we see ancient Egyptian temples today, they're just a bunch of ruins, they're brown walls, and they look very drab. But in the ancient world, we know that they painted all of their walls, and they were beautiful works of art, and the location of these temples, being close to a river, were often watered and were full of a garden environment, very lush and overflowing. And so the perspective then of God making a garden and setting apart a garden speaks to the ancient perspective that God is making his dwelling place. This is where he lives. And so it's no surprise then that God walks with Adam in the garden in the cool of the day. Why? Because that's, well, his dwelling place. And so he has set them in there. And he has set these trees with them in the garden for them to, one, to not eat from, and one, to eat from. And they're meant to take care of the garden, to look after it, and to cultivate it, just like the ancient world priests were in any temple. And God makes a covenant with Adam. This is the first covenant and first real consequential instruction in the book of Genesis and in the Bible as a whole. And this Adamic covenant is simply that they can eat from any tree they want except for one. So Adam has one job. And what God says to Adam is, if you eat of this tree, then in that day you will die. Now, when God says this to him, he's not saying it as a threat. He's saying it as a matter of fact. Okay, so God's not threatening him. If you eat from that tree, I'm going to kill you. God's just saying, hey, if you choose to do that, you will die. That's just how it's going to happen. Okay? So he gives him this instruction. And if Adam and Eve choose to disobey and to eat from the tree, then there will be consequences of death. That is just the natural repercussions of their choice. So that's what is being established in chapter 2. Now, with that, after the destruction, God sees that Adam is alone and needs a companion, and that none of the animals of the earth have met that standard, and so God is going to create a companion for Adam. Now, one of the things, interestingly, that God will say that is not good. Okay. Now, this can kind of mess with us a little bit if we think that the goodness of something is its moral standard. How could God have made something that was not good? And it's that Adam does not have the full function of humanity. Right? It is not good for Adam to be alone. Right? It does not work properly. And what we see then from the very beginning is that God had always created humanity with the intention of community. Right? From the very beginning, that humanity was created with the intention of being around other people, which should confront our Western individualistic mindsets that think that I can be a lone ranger running with God, and that all I need is God. Because when all Adam had was God, God says it's not good enough. And so before the fall, God said humans need humans, not just me. Now, when we go around and we say, all I need is Jesus, that's true when it comes to salvation. But in most other areas, it's not. In pretty much every other area, God has said humans need each other. And so our value for one another should be incredible. We should care about one another because that was God's intention from the beginning, is that we would be with each other. And we must value the community and the people that we are with. Now, everything seems hunky-dory at the end of chapter 2. It's all going well. Nice and smooth in the garden. Adam and Eve seem to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. And then you open up chapter 3 of Genesis. And once you get into chapter 3, there are a number of questions right away. Right? Why did God create this snake? Right? I don't want to call him, I have Satan on the slide, but I don't want to call him Satan too fast, because it's not until the New Testament that he's referred to as Satan. Right? But that is often a question that people will ask here. Is this a real snake, or is it just a symbolic moment? Is this just a story that's being told, or was it an actual serpent? Because in the ancient world, serpents had multiple understandings. They were not just evil creatures. Sometimes they were signs of wisdom and protection, and other times they were signs of deception or destruction. Like pretty much every ancient cosmology viewed snakes as inhabitants of the underworld. So every night, when Ra goes under the earth, he battles the great snake of the underworld. So there wasn't really a firm say on whether they're good or bad, but just that they were there. Now, if this is a real snake, or not, it doesn't really change the point of the situation of what is going on with it. But it could be that Moses is using a symbol that people are familiar with, or that is exactly what had happened here. But when the snake tempts Eve, he begins to speak to her in verse 1b. So would someone read from 1b down through verse 3? Or sorry, let's do through verse 5.
He said to the woman, "Did God actually say, 'You shall not eat of any tree in the garden'?" And the woman said to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, 'You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'"
Okay. So we get this initial temptation from this serpent. And this temptation should strike us as ironic. Okay? As soon as we begin reading it. Why? Well, chapter 1, verse 26 says they were already made in the image of God and in his likeness. So the serpent is tempting them that God doesn't want you to be like him. And so this begins one of the greatest kind of temptations of the serpent throughout all of human history, and that is that God is withholding from his people. That in some way God is holding himself back, and that they deserve better. And this would be a constant temptation, I think, in Christians' lives as well, that they think that the world somehow has it better. That's always the temptation of Satan. Always the temptation. Oh, the world has it more fun. It's way better to go out and enjoy yourself. At the club, with another person, whatever you want to do that brings you the most fun and pleasure in your life. The world has it much better. Why would you hold yourself back from that kind of stuff? Right? Doesn't God want you to be happy? He put dopamine receptors in your brain for a reason. So you can enjoy yourself. Okay? This idea that God is somehow withholding from his people his goodness has always been the temptation. And so it should be ironic because Adam and Eve were already made in the image and likeness of God. They were already as like God as they will ever be. They are not going to be more like God. But through their action of eating the tree, they're going to attempt to usurp the position of God. Okay, that means to try to overthrow or to take the place of God. Now, the response of Eve, that even if she touches the tree that she would die, is of course wrong. But it is probably a logical thought. Because, of course, if you're going to eat from the tree, then you would have had to touch it. And so to even have touched the tree would end up leading to you eating it and leading ultimately to your death. And so I don't think it's that Eve just inherently believes that, but is more of a protection for them, right? Just don't even touch it, right? It just is a safeguard, probably. So that's probably why it's probably not just a miscommunication or misunderstanding on their end. But what we do know from the story as it progresses is that Adam is there with her the whole time. He receives the fruit as well and eats from the fruit, and both of them disobey God together. Now, was the tree just full of sin, and whenever you eat it, sin just fills your body? Probably not. Okay. It said that everything God put in the garden was good. It worked rightly, properly, functioned well. And so the tree in and of itself is probably not full of evil, but it's the fact that God has given a command about the tree. Okay? Adam and Eve already knew what good and evil were before they ate from the tree. Because you have to know that it is wrong to eat from the tree, thus it being evil to eat from the tree. You know the right and the wrong thing to do. You know it is good and you know it is evil. You know it is evil to eat from the tree, and you know it is good to eat from the tree of life. So Adam and Eve already knew what good and evil were conceptually. What this story is about Adam and Eve's usurping the position of God for themselves so that they will get to determine what is good and evil. So that they will get to say what is right and wrong. And this is a decision about morality. That from the very beginning, what man attempted to do was to take the place of God to say that I will decide what is right and wrong. And that is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about. It is about choosing for yourself what is right and what is wrong. And as soon as Eve took the apple or the fruit and ate it for herself, she said, what I think is right, and what God says is right is wrong. And we have been at a battle ever since. What is humanity's primary definer of right and wrong? Any thoughts? Which comes down to yourself, right? Humanity's primary definition for right and wrong is themselves, which is what Adam and Eve brought upon us at the very beginning, when they decided that I will choose what's right and wrong instead of God. And what we have got to work ourselves back to is to say, I will follow what God says is right and what he says is wrong, not what I think is right and what I think is wrong. And that is the continual battle for humanity ever since. And so, this is the essence, right? And this is why this is why we can get confusing between when God says something is good, as it being morally good instead of functionally good, is because of the fact that we look at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and think, oh, the knowledge of good means moral rightness or proper morality, whereas the tree means that, but that doesn't have to do with the function of humanity, right? So morally, the tree is good. It is this picture of that thing. But the tree itself didn't fill them with the knowledge of good and evil. It was at that moment they decided for themselves what was good and evil, and thus their eyes were opened when they first decided to disobey God. And so this is the central point of all human alienation from God, rebellion. where as humans we will look at God and we will say, I don't think so, or you're wrong, and what I think is more right than what you say. And so it brings upon this shame on both Adam and Eve, and they hide themselves because they have rebelled against God. And in their own pride, they have said that I know better than you do. You might say that's wrong. I'm going to say it's right. And so we have got to be aware of that in our own lives as well, to ask the question, how am I submitting myself to God's standards instead of the world's standards? What is the basis of my moral decisions? Are they what I think is best, or are they what God says is best? Do I allow myself to be more shaped by the world and the people around me and the culture around me, or do I allow myself to be shaped by the Creator who gave the world purpose? These are vital questions for us. And so I think this question pretty much sums it up. How do we gauge what is right and wrong? In our own lives, in the world around us, what is our basis for determining what's right and wrong? It's a sad place to leave it, but I don't want to take another 10 minutes to go through the rest of the chapter. So let me pray, and I think this is a really good question for us to end on. So, Lord, thank you so much for this book that is just so important for us. Lord, how profound the message is, God, and just how amazing you are, Lord, that we see your power, we see your purpose and your intention, and with that we find our security in you, Lord. We see what your intention was for creation, God, and we want to walk with that, Lord. We want to make you our basis for all of our moral decisions and all of our standards, God, that we would not be that in and of ourselves, but we would look to you. God, I pray you would help us to shape our minds. And Lord, help the book of Genesis to form us into the people who you want us to become, so that we might live faithfully as you've shown yourself faithful. Lord, we love you so much. Pray these things in your name. Amen.
Okay.